700 pounds of flesh, bone, and arrogance standing in a ring, telling every camera and microphone in Tokyo that Bruce Lee was nothing special, just a normal man, an actor who kicked air for a living. Those words travelled across the Pacific and landed on the desk of a man who weighed less than a quarter of the giant who spoke them. Bruce Lee heard every syllable. He didn't respond with words. He responded with a plane ticket. And what happened inside that ring didn't just shut one mouth. It rewired what an entire generation believed was physically possible. His name was Takamura Koji. In 1968, he was the most feared figure in Asian combat sports, and he had earned that reputation the old-fashioned way, by making grown men crumble. Koji wasn't your typical sumo wrestler. Most top-level sumo competitors weighed between 300 and 400 pounds. Koji weighed nearly double the low end of that range. 700 pounds of conditioned, disciplined, surprisingly athletic mass that had gone undefeated in 34 consecutive bouts in Japan's elite sumo circuit. He had shattered records that had stood for decades. He had hospitalized opponents so frequently that 2 wrestlers retired rather than face him a second time. One match in Osaka ended in 11 seconds when Koji palmed his opponent's chest and launched him backwards so violently that the man cleared the dokkyo ring entirely and crashed into the second row of spectators. The referee didn't even finish counting. The opponent was unconscious before he landed, but Koji wasn't satisfied with dominating sumo. By 1968, he had grown bored with the ritualized world of traditional Japanese wrestling. He wanted something bigger, something louder, something international. So he did what no elite sumo wrestler had done before. He crossed over. He began accepting open challenges from martial artists of every discipline, in every weight class, with no restrictions. Judo players, karate experts, Muay Thai fighters, Western boxers. Koji fought them all, and Koji destroyed them all. His record in these cross-discipline exhibitions stood at an astonishing 19 wins, 0 losses, with an average match duration of under 15 seconds. Nobody could handle the combination of his size, his speed, and his technique. People assumed he was just a wall of fat. They were catastrophically wrong. Koji had trained since childhood. His footwork was precise. His grip strength had been measured at over 300 pounds of force per hand. When he grabbed you, it was like being clamped inside an industrial vice wrapped in human skin. Your bones would flex, your joints would scream, and your brain would send one single desperate message to every limb. Quit now, or something permanent is about to happen. This was the man who sat in front of Japanese television cameras in March of 1968 and delivered a statement that would eventually cross an ocean. The interviewer had asked him a simple question about Bruce Lee. By then, Lee was becoming globally known. The Green Hornet had aired. His demonstrations at martial arts expos had become legendary. Magazines were printing his name beside words like revolutionary and genius. So the interviewer asked Koji what he thought about this phenomenon from Hong Kong, this small man who claimed to have redefined fighting. Koji didn't pause. He didn't consider the question carefully. He leaned forward, and with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been proven wrong, he said something that translates roughly to this. Bruce Lee is just a normal man. He is small. He is light. He performs for cameras. What he does is entertainment. What I do is real. If he stood in front of me, he would last less time than it takes to draw a breath. Put him in a ring with me, and the world will see the difference between a movie and a fight. The Japanese press printed it everywhere. The quote spread through martial arts circles across Asia within days. It reached Hong Kong. It reached Los Angeles. It reached a small training studio on College Street in Chinatown, where a 140-pound man was working a wooden dummy at 3 a.m, drilling the same centerline punch over and over until the wood was slick with sweat from his forearms. Someone brought him the magazine. Someone translated the quote. Bruce Lee read it once. His expression didn't shift. He set the magazine on a bench, returned to the wooden dummy, and continued training. But the rhythm of his strikes changed. They got faster. Not by much, just enough that the only other person in the room, a senior student who had trained with Bruce for 4 years, noticed. And that student felt something he had never felt while watching Bruce Lee train. He felt afraid, not of Bruce, for whoever was going to stand across from him next. The challenge was formalized within 6 weeks. A promoter named Hayashi Ren, who had been organizing cross-discipline fighting exhibitions across Japan and Southeast Asia, saw the media firestorm and recognized an opportunity that comes along once in a generation. He reached out to both camps simultaneously. To Koji's management, he offered a guaranteed purse plus a percentage of ticket revenue. To Bruce Lee, he offered something far more valuable than money. He offered a stage, a public, internationally covered, fully legitimate stage where Bruce could answer the insult in the only language that would matter, not words, contact. Bruce accepted within 48 hours. He had one condition: no time limit. The fight ends when one man cannot continue. Koji's camp agreed immediately. They interpreted the condition as recklessness. A man who weighs 140 pounds asking for no time limit against a man who weighs 700 pounds isn't being brave. He's writing his own medical report. That was their thinking. They were not alone in that assessment. The venue was set for June 15, 1968, at the Kuramai Kokugikan in Tokyo, the same arena where Japan's most prestigious sumo tournaments were held. 12,000 seats, every single one sold out within 72 hours of the announcement. Scalpers were getting 5 times face value. Newspapers from 6 countries sent reporters. 2 television networks secured broadcasting rights. This was not a backroom exhibition. This was an international event built around a single question that had gripped the martial arts world by the throat. Can speed defeat size? Can technique overcome mass? Can Bruce Lee do what no one had ever done, make 700 pounds irrelevant? The build-up in the press was relentless. Japanese sports writers treated it almost as a national pride issue. Koji was their champion, their symbol of physical dominance. He represented a tradition stretching back centuries. Bruce Lee, in their framing, was an outsider, a Chinese actor from Hollywood who had made his reputation breaking boards and performing choreographed sequences. They published the physical comparison statistics side by side, and the numbers read like a mismatch report. Koji stood 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighed 700 pounds. His neck measured 28 inches around. His thigh circumference was larger than Bruce Lee's waist. His handspan was 13 inches. Bruce stood 5 feet 7 inches and weighed 140 pounds. His waist was 28 inches. His biceps were barely 14 inches. One Japanese columnist wrote a piece titled "The Fly and the Hammer," in which he predicted the fight would last under 5 seconds and suggested that the Athletic Commission should intervene on humanitarian grounds. Another wrote that Bruce Lee was either the bravest man in martial arts or the most delusional, and that the distinction would become clear approximately 3 seconds after the opening bell. Bruce Lee read none of it. This was deliberate. In the weeks before the fight, he entered a phase that those closest to him had seen before, but never at this intensity. He stopped socializing almost entirely. He reduced his teaching schedule to 2 sessions per week. He spent the remaining hours in a cycle of training, study, and something that looked to outsiders like meditation, but was actually closer to engineering. Bruce was building a blueprint, not a training plan, a structural analysis of a problem that every martial artist in the world considered unsolvable. How do you fight someone who outweighs you by 560 pounds? The conventional answers were useless, and Bruce knew it. You cannot outmuscle a 700-pound man. You cannot trade blows with a 700-pound man. You cannot grapple with a 700-pound man. You cannot clinch with a 700-pound man. Every traditional martial arts strategy assumed some reasonable proximity in size between opponents. This fight existed outside those assumptions. It required something that didn't exist yet, so Bruce built it. He started with film. He obtained footage of 11 of Koji's cross-discipline fights and watched each one between 30 and 40 times. He watched them at normal speed, at half speed, frame by frame. He watched them with the sound off. He watched them mirrored, flipped horizontally to see the movement patterns from the opposite angle. And buried inside those hours of footage, he found what he was looking for. Every fighter has a tell, a moment in their movement where their body commits before their brain catches up. For most trained fighters, that tell is microscopic. A slight shift of the front foot, a dip of the lead shoulder, a half-inch tilt of the hips. These signals are invisible to casual observers, and barely perceptible even to experienced martial artists watching in real time. But Bruce Lee did not watch in real time. He watched frame by frame. And in those frozen slivers of motion, Koji's tell revealed itself like a crack in a fortress wall. It happened every single time, in all 11 fights, without exception. When Koji initiated his attack, he dropped his right shoulder approximately 2 inches and shifted his center of gravity forward onto his left foot before driving ahead. That weight transfer took roughly 0.6 of a second. During those 0.6 of a second, his entire right side was momentarily unanchored. His right foot was light, his right hip was open. His balance for that fraction of a heartbeat depended entirely on forward momentum. If that momentum was interrupted, if something happened during that 0.6 of a second that redirected or destabilized his forward motion, then 700 pounds of mass would become 700 pounds of liability. Because momentum is not strength. Momentum is a loan from physics, and physics always collects. Bruce mapped this vulnerability across all 11 fights. The shoulder drop happened at the same depth every time. The weight shift followed the same sequence every time. The window was always 0.6 of a second, never longer, never shorter. Koji had performed this entry so many thousands of times across his career that it had become as automatic as breathing. And just like breathing, he had absolutely no awareness he was doing it. This was his foundation. And foundations, Bruce understood, are the most dangerous weaknesses of all, because no one thinks to protect what they believe is unbreakable. But identifying the vulnerability was only half the equation. The other half was engineering a response that could exploit it within a window shorter than a single heartbeat. Bruce needed a technique that accomplished 3 things simultaneously. First, it had to redirect Koji's forward momentum without attempting to stop it. Stopping 700 pounds moving forward is impossible for a 140-pound man. That's not a fighting problem. That's a physics impossibility. You cannot stop a freight train by standing on the tracks, but you can open a switch and send it down a different rail. Second, the technique had to destabilize Koji's base during the exact moment his right side was unanchored. Not before the shoulder drop, when he was still balanced. Not after, when his momentum had already carried him into a stable position. During, the window was 0.6 of a second and shrinking. Third, the technique had to deliver a decisive finishing element, because with a man this size, you do not get second chances. If Bruce exploited the window and failed to end the engagement, Koji would adjust. He would close the gap. He would grab hold. And at that point, all the analysis in the world wouldn't prevent 140 pounds from being compressed by 700. Bruce spent 3 weeks building this technique from scratch. It didn't exist in Wing Chun. It didn't exist in Western boxing. It didn't exist in any martial art Bruce had studied across 15 years of obsessive cross-training. So he invented it. He synthesized elements from 4 different systems into a single fluid motion that lasted less than 2 seconds from initiation to completion. The entry came from fencing, an angular advance that moved the body offline while closing distance. The redirection came from Wing Chun, a principle called borrowing force, where you use your opponent's energy against their own structure. The destabilization came from Judo, a subtle sweep concept targeting the ankle of the weight-bearing foot at the precise moment of maximum load. And the finish came from somewhere that had no name, somewhere inside Bruce Lee's understanding of the human body that transcended any single system. He had studied anatomy and kinesiology with the same intensity that medical students study for board exams. He knew exactly where to apply force to create maximum neurological disruption with minimum physical effort. He drilled this sequence hundreds of times against training partners who simulated Koji's charge. He adjusted angles by fractions of degrees. He refined timing by hundredths of seconds. And by the end of 3 weeks, the technique was no longer something he performed. It was something his body simply did, the way a heart beats, without thought, without delay, without the possibility of hesitation. The blueprint was complete. Now he just needed the ring. Tokyo in June is heavy. The air holds moisture like a sponge that refuses to release, and the heat sits on your skin the moment you step outside. June 15th, 1968 was no different. By noon, the temperature had climbed past 85 degrees, and the humidity was thick enough to taste. The Kuramai Kokugikan had no modern air conditioning. 12,000 bodies packed into a structure designed for traditional sumo would generate their own weather system. By the time the main event arrived, the arena would be sweltering. None of that mattered to the people lined up outside the venue at 7 in the morning, 8 hours before the first preliminary bout. They came with box lunches and paper fans, and the particular restless energy of people who believe they are about to witness something historic. Street vendors materialized outside the arena selling unofficial merchandise. Hand-printed posters showing a tiny silhouette facing an enormous one. T-shirts with Japanese characters reading, "The Fly and the Hammer," borrowed from the columnist who had predicted Bruce Lee's destruction. Someone was even selling small paper origami cranes with the fighters' names written on opposite wings, the idea being you tear the crane in half after the fight and keep the winner's wing. Almost every vendor reported the same trend. Nobody was buying the wing with Bruce Lee's name on it. Inside the arena, the atmosphere shifted as the hours passed. Preliminary bouts filled the afternoon. Regional karate champions, judo demonstrations, a brief and brutal Muay Thai exhibition that left bloodstains on the canvas. But the crowd treated these events the way moviegoers treat previews. Polite attention, scattered applause, eyes drifting toward watches. Everyone was waiting for the same thing, and everyone knew it. By 6 in the evening, the arena was at capacity, 12,000 seated, another several hundred standing in restricted areas where security had quietly stopped enforcing the rules because there were simply too many bodies. The noise was constant, a hum of conversation and anticipation that vibrated through the concrete floors like a low electrical current. Behind the eastern entrance, in a preparation room reserved for the headline competitor, Koji went through his pre-fight ritual. He had performed this ritual before every bout since he was 19 years old. A series of stretches that looked almost meditative, slow rotations of his enormous neck, deep squats that made the floorboards groan under the redistribution of his weight, then the stomp, the shiko, the sacred sumo exercise, lifting one leg high and driving it down into the earth with enough force to register on sensitive equipment 3 rooms away. Each stomp was a declaration. I am here. I am immovable. The ground itself answers to me. His team surrounded him, a manager, 2 trainers, a nutritionist, and a man whose sole job was to tape Koji's wrists and ankles with enough reinforced athletic wrap to support joints that carried an almost incomprehensible daily load. Koji spoke little. He had said everything he intended to say in that television interview months ago. Bruce Lee was a normal man. Tonight would prove it. There was nothing left to discuss. On the opposite side of the arena, behind the western entrance, Bruce Lee sat alone on a wooden bench in a room that smelled of old concrete and fresh paint. He had requested no team, no entourage, no corner support. Dan Inosanto had flown in from Los Angeles and was seated in the 3rd row, but Bruce had asked him not to come backstage. This was deliberate. Bruce's preparation was internal. He sat with his eyes closed, breathing at a rhythm so controlled that his chest barely moved. His hands rested open on his knees. If you had walked into that room not knowing what was about to happen, you might have assumed this man was waiting for a bus. There was no visible tension in his body, no nervous energy, no shadowboxing, no pacing, just stillness. But that stillness was deceptive. Behind those closed eyes, Bruce Lee was running the sequence, the 6/10 of a second window, the angular advance, the redirection, the sweep, the finish. He ran it forward. He ran it from different entry points. He ran it against variations. What if Koji came faster? What if he came slower? What if he dropped the left shoulder instead? What if he didn't drop either? Each variation had a response. Each response had been drilled until it required no thought. His body was a loaded mechanism waiting for a single specific trigger, and that trigger was a 2-inch drop of a right shoulder belonging to the largest man he had ever faced. A knock on the door, a tournament official, clipboard in hand, bowing slightly. 5 minutes, Mr. Lee. Bruce opened his eyes. He stood. He buttoned his jacket, the black mandarin collar, the same one. He rolled his neck once, cracked his knuckles, and walked toward the door. His footsteps were silent on the concrete floor. 140 pounds moving like smoke through a corridor, that led towards 700 pounds of absolute certainty. The lights inside the Kuramae Kokugikan dimmed at exactly 8:47 p.m. 12,000 conversations collapsed into murmurs, then into whispers, then into a silence so complete you could hear the electrical hum of the overhead fixtures cycling down. A single overhead beam snapped on, white and harsh, carving a perfect circle of light onto the raised platform at the center of the arena. The platform was not a traditional sumo doyo. Hayashi Ren had commissioned a custom fighting surface, a square elevated stage, 20 feet by 20 feet, padded but firm, bordered by low ropes on all four sides. This was a deliberate choice. No ring corners to hide in, no high ropes to lean against. An open platform where movement and strategy mattered as much as power and weight. Whether this favored Bruce Lee or Koji depended entirely on who you asked. The sumo camp believed it gave Koji more room to build momentum for his devastating charges. Bruce Lee's assessment of the platform, if he ever shared it, was never recorded, but the design suggested that Bruce would have room to move laterally, and lateral movement was the foundation of everything he had engineered over the previous 3 weeks. The announcer walked into the light. He was an older Japanese man in a dark suit, known across the country for calling sumo tournaments and boxing matches. His voice had the weight of ceremony behind it. He spoke in Japanese first, then repeated each line in English for the international press contingent seated along the north side of the arena. He introduced the event as an exhibition of cross-discipline martial combat. He listed the rules, which were almost non-existent. No eye gouging, no strikes to the groin, no biting. Everything else was permitted. Strikes, throws, joint locks, chokes, sweeps, holds. The fight would continue until one man could not. There were no rounds, there were no points, there was no judge's decision, only continuation or conclusion. He reminded the audience that both fighters had agreed to these terms voluntarily and that a licensed medical team was positioned at ringside. Then he called the first name, Takamura Koji. The eastern entrance opened and Koji emerged into the corridor of light that connected the tunnel to the stage. The sound hit first. 12,000 people inhaling simultaneously, a collective gasp that created an audible vacuum in the arena. Koji wore the traditional sumo mawashi, the thick belt wrapped tightly around his waist and between his legs, and nothing else. His body was fully exposed under the overhead lighting, and the sheer scale of him made the platform look like it had been built for children. His shoulders spanned nearly 4 feet. His belly, which uninformed spectators might mistake for softness, was a wall of layered muscle and mass that had absorbed thousands of impacts over 2 decades of competition. His legs were columns, not metaphorical columns, structural supports that looked engineered rather than grown, each thigh wider than most men's torsos. He climbed the 3 steps to the platform, and the structure groaned audibly under the weight transfer. He walked to his position, the eastern side of the stage, and stood still. He did not perform. He did not flex. He did not acknowledge the crowd. He simply existed in the light, and his existence was the most persuasive argument the audience had ever encountered for why this fight was a terrible idea. Then the second name, Bruce Lee. The western entrance opened, and for a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The corridor was dark. The audience leaned forward. Then he appeared, and the contrast nearly broke the audience's ability to process visual information. Where Koji had filled the tunnel from wall to wall, Bruce Lee seemed to occupy almost no space at all. He wore black from collar to ankle, the mandarin jacket, the simple cotton pants, no tape on his hands, no protective equipment of any kind. He moved down the corridor with a fluidity that was difficult to describe because it didn't match any athletic movement the audience had a reference for. He wasn't walking with the heavy, deliberate steps of a fighter approaching combat. He wasn't bouncing on his toes like a boxer. He was gliding, each step transferring into the next, without any visible moment of settling. His weight never committed fully to either foot. He reached the platform, climbed the steps without using the handrail, and crossed to his position on the western side. The platform made no sound beneath him. Where Koji's arrival had caused the structure to protest, Bruce's arrival went unregistered. If you had closed your eyes, you would not have known anyone had stepped onto the stage at all. They faced each other across 20 feet of open space. The image was so dramatically uneven that nervous laughter scattered through several sections of the arena. One photographer from a Tokyo daily lowered his camera and shook his head. He later told colleagues that looking through the viewfinder made him feel complicit in something cruel. The visual gap between these two men was not a sports matchup. It was an emergency. The referee stepped to the center of the platform, raised one hand, looked at Koji, who nodded once, then looked at Bruce, who did nothing. No nod, no acknowledgement. His eyes were already locked on Koji's right shoulder. The referee's hand dropped. The fight began. Koji did not hesitate. There was no feeling out period, no cautious circling, no tactical assessment of range. Koji launched himself forward from a standing position with an explosive push off both feet that sent 700 pounds hurtling across the platform at a speed that defied every assumption about what a body that size could do. His arms spread wide, his torso leaned forward, his mouth opened slightly with the exertion of accelerating that much mass that quickly. The audience experienced this charge not just visually but physically. The platform transmitted the vibration of his footfalls through the arena support structure and into the concrete seating. People in the first 4 rows felt it in their chests. One woman later described it as feeling like the building itself had started running. This was the attack that had ended 19 fights. The avalanche, the human landslide. 700 pounds of forward-moving force with 2 arms spread wide enough to close off every escape angle. Every previous opponent had been swallowed by it, engulfed, wrapped up and compressed and driven downward into the mat with the full gravitational authority of a body that weighed as much as some motorcycles. Bruce Lee watched it come, and in the fraction of time between Koji's launch and Koji's arrival, something happened that 12,000 people saw, but almost none of them understood until much later. Bruce's eyes dropped to Koji's right shoulder. The shoulder dipped, 2 inches down, exactly as it had in every single one of the 11 filmed fights Bruce had studied. The weight transferred to the left foot. The right side became momentarily light. The window opened. 0.6 of a second. Bruce moved, not backward, not to the side in a simple lateral dodge. He moved forward and to the right, directly toward the unanchored side of Koji's body, closing the distance rather than expanding it. This was the fencing advance, the angular entry that put Bruce inside Koji's reach before Koji's arms could close. For the audience, this looked suicidal. A small man stepping toward an oncoming avalanche. Several spectators shouted. One man in the press section stood involuntarily. Dan Inosanto, in the 3rd row, stopped breathing entirely. Bruce's left hand made contact with the inside of Koji's right forearm as the massive arm swept toward him. He did not block it. He did not push it. He redirected it, a Wing Chun principle executed with such precision that Koji's own sweeping force carried his right arm 3 inches further than intended. 3 inches past the point where it would have connected with Bruce's body. 3 inches of emptiness where capture should have been. Koji's left arm was still closing from the opposite side, but Bruce was no longer between the arms. He was beside them, beside Koji, positioned at the exact 90-degree angle, where Koji's forward momentum made turning impossible without first decelerating, and deceleration takes time that Bruce had no intention of granting. Then the sweep. Bruce's right foot hooked behind Koji's left ankle, the weight-bearing ankle, the anchor holding 700 pounds in a forward-leaning trajectory. The hook was not forceful. It did not need to be. It was timed to the millisecond of maximum load, when every pound of Koji's mass was channeled through that single joint. Bruce did not pull Koji's foot out from under him. He displaced it 2 inches, just 2 inches laterally, and those 2 inches removed the structural foundation from beneath a body that was already committed beyond the point of recovery. 700 pounds does not fall the way normal weight falls. It cascades. Koji's balance collapsed not in one motion but in a sequence. The ankle shifted, the knee buckled inward, the hip rotated, and the torso followed with the terrible inevitability of a building losing its load-bearing wall. His body pitched forward and to the left, his arms still reaching for a target that was no longer there. The platform shuddered as his mass began its descent. And then the finish. Before Koji's body reached the mat, before 700 pounds completed its journey from vertical to horizontal, Bruce's right hand fired upward, an open palm strike aimed at the precise cluster of nerves beneath the hinge of Koji's jaw. The strike connected during the fall, while Koji's neck muscles were stretched and unbraced, while his brain was still processing the impossible information that he was somehow going down. The impact was surgical, not a bludgeon. A key turned in exactly the right lock. Koji's eyes lost focus instantly. His arms went slack. The remaining distance to the mat was covered by gravity alone, and when he hit, the sound was something no person in that arena had heard before or would hear again. The platform absorbed the impact the way a drum absorbs a mallet strike. It didn't just receive the force, it broadcast it. The sound of 700 pounds hitting a padded surface from a height of nearly 4 feet was not a thud. It was a detonation, a low, resonant boom that travelled through the support structure, through the concrete floor, through the metal frames of 12,000 seats, and into the bones of every person present. Several audience members later reported that they felt the impact before they heard it. The vibration arrived through their feet and their spines a fraction of a second before the sound reached their ears. Koji lay motionless on the platform. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the overhead lights without registering them. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven cycles. He was breathing. He was alive. But he was not conscious in any meaningful sense. His brain had received a neurological interrupt so precisely delivered that it had temporarily suspended voluntary motor function. He was not asleep. He was not knocked out in the way a boxer gets knocked out, where the head snaps and the legs buckle from concussive force. This was different. This was a system shutdown, a targeted disruption of the nerve cluster that connects conscious intention to physical action. His body was present. His mind was somewhere else entirely, rebooting like a machine that had encountered an error it was never designed to handle. The referee rushed forward. The medical team followed, 3 men with bags and stretchers moving with the urgency of people who had prepared for this exact scenario but had never truly believed it would unfold in this direction. They had expected to treat Bruce Lee. Every contingency plan, every pre-positioned piece of equipment, every whispered conversation between medical staff in the hours before the fight had centered on the small man getting hurt. Not the giant. The stretcher they brought was standard size. It was not built for a 700-pound man. They would need to send for a reinforced transport board, which delayed Koji's removal from the platform by several minutes. During those minutes, the arena existed in a state of collective incomprehension. 12,000 people had watched something they could not reconcile with their understanding of physical reality. The largest man most of them had ever seen was lying on his back, felled by the smallest man on the platform. Not after a prolonged battle, not after an exhausting war of attrition that slowly wore the giant down. The entire exchange, from the referee's signal to Koji's body hitting the mat, had taken less than 4 seconds. 4 seconds. The audience had barely completed a single exhalation. Some had blinked and missed the critical mechanics entirely. They saw Koji charge. They saw a blur of black fabric. They heard the boom. And now Koji was horizontal, and Bruce Lee was standing exactly where the fight had ended, feet together, hands at his sides, breathing normally. Not panting, not flushed, not vibrating with adrenaline the way fighters vibrate after a dramatic finish. He looked the same as he had when he walked into the arena. Calm, collected, as if the preceding 4 seconds had cost him no more effort than opening a door. The silence lasted 11 seconds. Someone in the production crew timed it later from the audio recording. 11 full seconds of 12,000 people producing no sound at all. Then it broke, not with applause, not with cheering. With a sound that witnesses described as closer to an ocean wave, a rolling, building roar that started in the upper sections and cascaded downward until it filled every cubic inch of the Kuramai Kokugikan with raw, unfiltered human astonishment. People were not celebrating. They were processing. They were screaming because their brains needed an outlet for information that didn't fit anywhere in their existing framework of what was possible. Strangers grabbed each other. A man in the 7th row was openly weeping without understanding why. The older martial artist in attendance sat perfectly still, recognizing that what they had witnessed was not merely a victory but a fundamental rearrangement of everything they understood about combat. Bruce Lee stepped off the platform without ceremony. He walked down the steps, moved through the corridor, and disappeared into the western tunnel. He did not raise his arms. He did not bow to the crowd. He did not look back at the man still lying on the stage. Dan Inosanto found him 20 minutes later in the preparation room, sitting on the same wooden bench, jacket unbuttoned, drinking water from a paper cup. Dan's hands were shaking. His voice cracked when he tried to speak. He managed one word: how. Bruce set the cup down. He looked at Dan with an expression that contained no triumph, no satisfaction, no excitement, just clarity, the expression of a man who had identified a problem, engineered a solution, and executed it exactly as designed. "He is not a mountain," Bruce said quietly. "He is a man who has never been asked a question he couldn't answer with size. Tonight, I asked him a different question, and his size answered for him in the wrong direction." Koji recovered fully within 30 minutes. He never publicly discussed the fight. He never called Bruce Lee a normal man again. And in martial arts circles across Asia, across America, across every school and dojo and kwun where people had been taught that bigger always wins, a 4-second piece of footage began circulating that made them question everything. Not because a small man beat a giant, because a small man made beating a giant look like it was never even a contest. And the lesson buried inside those 4 seconds would outlast both men, both careers, and the arena itself.